Physiological aspects of autism spectrum disorder is a set of neurodevelopmental disorders characterized by social deficits, communication difficulties, and repetitive behaviors. This is a definition that is set by the book. Recently, within past years, autism has increased in the diagnosis, not necessarily due to different factors that contribute to the increase, but to the effectiveness of the diagnosis capability. Within this PowerPoint, the main topics that will be discussed would be DSM classification, the major symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, neurological mechanisms/systems, the parts of the brain that are included, the neurotransmitters that are involved, the medication treatment, the effectiveness of the medication, the side effects of the medication, along with that alternative forms of treatment. Within the classification, autism spectrum disorder falls under the DSM-5 classification, which includes behavioral and mental conditions that involve psychological and neurotransmission disorders. Basically, it is broad spectrum of what is included that falls within the boundaries of the behavioral and mental conditions that are becoming more socially acceptable as disorders. In the next slide, there will be an actual list of what those. So on the far left picture right here, we see kind of like a word scramble of different things that can be included with within the DSM-F classification. Those things are include but are not limited to paranoia, obsessive compulsive disorder, autism, of course, neurological aspects of disorders, obsessions, and depression. Eating disorders are included in the middle, so things such as anorexia, nervosa, and then on the far right we have the illustration of autism on how the brain is put together differently. Of course, like we know that the brain and the different neurotransmitters constitute for the different signaling in the brain and how it interacts with the world and how each individual is personalized with different interactions. This is more of a general outlook of what is included in DSM-F5. So that would be autism, Asperger's syndrome, pervasive development disorder, childhood integrative disorder, eating disorders, gender dysphoria, personality disorder, schizophrenia, social communication disorder, sleep-wake disorder, specific learning disorders, and obsessive compulsive disorders, which I had mentioned before in the previous slide. And this information was retrieved from the DSM-5 fact sheet found on the psychiatric.org website. So the major symptoms of the autism spectrum disorder are quite variable. So typically the symptoms can fall within really far off the spectrum or very close to the spectrum. It is considered a spectrum for a reason, so there is a polar opposite of the symptoms, or there could be very close knitted related symptoms. Those symptoms include, but are not limited to, impairment in communication, impairment in imagination, impairment in socialization. In regards to the IQ level, 55% have an intellectual disability, 16% have moderate to severe disability, which means that their IQ levels fall very low, and 28% have an average of intelligence. So they have an average of higher intelligence than what other students typically show when they are diagnosed. Along with that, they could either have an attention deficiency, or they can also have anxiety, tic disorders. Like I mentioned before, sometimes the symptoms are completely polar opposites, such as a child could either be affected with attention deficiency or hyperactivity disorder. Along with that, irritability, aggression, and self-injurious behaviors. When things like this do come about, it is very highly recommended that children with autism that are classified under the autism spectrum disorder are very well monitored to avoid any self-injury within the process of education, or if to avoid them getting irritated during the process of the learning environment. there are certain things that are set up in classrooms to avoid any increase in irritability. Neurological mechanisms. So in regards to this, I inputted what was said in the book about how different receptors contribute to autism spectrum disorder. One of the receptors that was very interesting to find out that was associated with autism spectrum disorder was oxytocin. The oxytocin receptor gene's downregulation, which results in the increased activity in the temporal parietal junction. The temporal parietal junction, of course, is responsible for a lot of self-cognitive behaviors or just self-awareness behaviors that are typically average in humans, but maybe either since the oxytocin receptor genes are downregulated, there are decrease in the autism spectrum disorder children. Along with that, there is alleles that contribute to the oxytocin receptor genes downregulation, such as the mutant allele of CD38, which of course leads to the lower oxytocin levels. Along with that, the interruption of the connection between the layers of the brain and the hemisphere. So in the actual neurological mechanisms, the connections that are going on within the brain, they are altered, which leads to different reactions. Along with that which also leads to the different neurological aspects that are going on in a person that is diagnosed with autism. Another gene that contributes to the differentiation between a person that has autism and a person who does not have autism is the AFF2 gene, which occurs most often in males than females. This gene has shown to be more present in people that do have the autism, that are diagnosed with the autism spectrum disorder. Along with that, the book does discuss how different environmental factors do contribute to the development of the autism spectrum disorder, specifically how epigenetics has proven that the autism spectrum disorder is affected by environmental factors. Of those environmental factors, however, one of those environmental factors that is not included in the research is vaccines. Unfavorable to popular belief, vaccinations are not proven to cause autism. In fact, it has been disproved that vaccines lead to the development of autism spectrum disorder. Another protein that is is decreased in people that have autism is the ROR protein. The brain. What parts of the brain are involved? Based on what I read about in the book, along with that different research papers, there's three main parts that constitute to what is infected in the brain of autism. Although autism spectrum disorder does affect different superficial layers of the brain, there's some specific ones that are included, such as the temporal parietal junction, which is located on the top right picture, the superficial layers of the cortex, as I did mention, the cerebellum, and the midbrain cortex. The neurotransmitters that are involved include the GABA, calcium, dopamine, serotonin, and the norepinephrine. So what the GABA is a neurotransmitter that sends chemical messages throughout the brain and throughout the nervous system. As we did learn in previous chapters, the GABA also contributes to a lot of inhibition when people do consume alcohol. Along with that, one of the other ones would be calcium. Calcium is responsible for a lot of activity in the cell. When it comes to the actual nervous system and neurotransmitters, it is very important in signal transduction pathways. Along with that, it serves as a second messenger in neurotransmitters that help with a lot of functions throughout the body, specifically motor functions. One of the other neurotransmitters that are involved is dopamine. Dopamine, of course, is known as an endorphin. As mentioned before, the symptoms that are included with autism, the autism spectrum disorder, are impairment of communication, impairment of imagination, and impairment of socialization. This is typically due to the fact of the lack of dopamine transmitters that are being transfused throughout the neurons. Uh, Another one would be serotonin. Serotonin is, of course, another neurotransmitter. It is responsible with feelings that uh, a lot of people with autism spectrum disorder do lack. They lack the that emotional, empathetic side of the neural pathways. The last one would be non-repinephrine, which again, another neurotransmitter. And surprisingly enough, it is also deals with emotions and with the process of learning. Here we have a typical on the right, no, I'm sorry. On the left, we have a typical uh, pathway of how dopamine metabolites are um, are used or are transmitted throughout the neural pathways. And then on the left, we have more of a how the hyperlation and depolarization of GABA and how the different synaptic signaling is different for a person that does have autism. Neurological interventions, specifically drug treatment, include but are not limited to risperidone, aripiprazole, quetiapine, and olanzapine. These are used in various forms, typically not to treat the autism spectrum disorder as a whole, but to treat specific symptoms, such as treating the irritation that is expressed by a person that has autism spectrum disorder. The alteration of neurotransmitters, specifically with the treatment, they increase the dopamine, they increase the different transmitters that I did mention before, and their metabolites. They contribute to the dopaminergic system, which constituted of different areas in the brain that are responsible for mood, attention, and other symptoms. So with this, what the drug does essentially is increase the signaling within the different synaptic clefts. The effectiveness of the medicine, of course, they vary per individual. Along with that, with the different dosages that are administered to the children. This graph right here shows a graph in which the different medication was inserted to rats that were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder or that had deficiencies in the particular neurotransmitters that were mentioned earlier. So basically with this one specifically, the neurotransmitter that is being displayed is norepinephrine. And what this shows is the increase of the neurotransmitter after the drug was administered. As we see, the saline had little to no effect. Therefore, since the rats are being the ones that are being used as experimental subjects, they don't have the placebo effect per se. And then the other two just show how there was an increase within the neurotransmitter after the administration of those two drugs. The side effects of taking medication. So the side effects include weight gain, fatigue, drowsiness, and increased levels of prolactin. And the increased levels of prolactin often cause an increase of feminine characteristics. Aside from just using drugs as a source to essentially decrease the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, there's other things such as therapy. In these pictures here, it just shows the different types of therapy that can be used to not necessarily diagnose, but to help cope with autism spectrum disorder. So that could be anything that goes from speech therapy, social skills therapy, music therapy, 101 social skills builder in robotics therapy and play therapy. Okay, and then this, of course, as I mentioned, is an autism spectrum disorder spectrum, very big highlight on spectrum because it is a various list of things that contribute to somebody being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. The works that are cited. Thank you.